Welcome everyone to the September session of Dr. Spotfire. My name is Neil Kanungo and I'm your host. I'm joined today by Dr. Integration, Jeff Leviton. Jeff, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. We're looking forward to a joint session for this September.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so we had a joint session, a collaboration here with Dr. Integration and Dr. Spotfire together, show you how more of the TIBCO suite can be used for business procedures, business operations, how to make your insights, turn your insights into actions faster. And today we're going to be focused on Spotfire Actions, so directly taking action from those insights, how to make that all streamlined and smooth within your analytics operations. So first, let me go through a little bit of our intro deck. Our motto with Dr. Spotfire is learning is not driven by answers, but by questions. Those questions you ask is what drives us to all learn more and pushes us into new frontiers and out of our comfort zone into new areas where we learn and build our skills. So learning is not driven by answers, but by questions. These sessions are all recorded. They're streamed live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can catch them on YouTube after the session at the link shown on your screen. So just in case you missed that, you can go ahead and go to our YouTube channel. I'd highly recommend subscribing to that channel as well. We got lots of quick tips coming out. Jose has been putting out new tips each week, so it's something to keep an eye on. So today's feature session is Intro to Cloud Actions. Cloud Actions is a new feature in Spotfire where you're going to be able to write transactions to any cloud or on-premise application. So it's actually going to integrate with TIBCO Cloud Integration, TCI, and the TIBCO Cloud Mesh. So you're able to access the TIBCO Cloud Mesh from, and we're going to explain what all of this means, but you're going to be able to access the TIBCO Cloud Mesh directly from Spotfire, and from there you can trigger hundreds of different actions to write to databases. You can assign Adobe sign documents. You can send Slack messages. You can update Google Sheets. You can you can string a bunch of actions together. And today we're going to show actually how to write back to Salesforce to create an account and a case and actually send an email all with one click. So with that, let me go ahead and get my screen share out. Give me 1 second. Have to switch screens here.
So many monitors.
So many monitors. And you got to keep the StreamYard one open. So it's always a little tricky, but here we go. Share my screen. Okay. So with Cloud Actions, what we have is you see this little icon here. This is a little email icon that's been added. What you're able to do is actually create an action from Spotfire. You have this new actions option in your menus. And here you can say new action, and you sign in with the TIBCO Cloud TCI. So this connects to the TIBCO Cloud Mesh. And then what that is, and Jeff's going to explain a little bit more about this, but it's a secure connection to your REST API endpoints. And so here you're going to have a Flogo app that you can connect to. We have this Dr. Spotfire Actions one that we've already connected to. We've already created, and I'm going to connect to it now. And I'm going to do one to create a new property. These are what we're looking at are different properties, different residential properties in the Chicago area. And I want to log these residential properties and commercial properties to Salesforce. So I can hit select here and I can call this create property. And in my records, I can choose how I want my records to be sent to Salesforce. So I can do one row for each ID. I can do for each address. This is going to select. What I'm doing right now is building the action to build one of these buttons right here. So I can configure this with my community area, the ID. I'm going to have the first aggregation for all of these. My latitude, We're going to do the first aggregation here. My longitude, scroll down to the bottom. First aggregation here. My property name and my zip code. And I can choose to do a different icon. So like this to log a property, I can choose all these from all these icons. I have this house right here. I'm going to choose this house. And I want to limit this by marking. And so I hit next and I hit done. And I now have this create property action. And I can add this into my visualization by going to add. And I want a floating button. I can add this as a create property icon that you're seeing right there. I can also add this as a right-click menu option. So when I right-click, you'll see create property right here. Or I can add this as a title bar button. And a title bar button will put that right there off the visualization. I like putting these as floating buttons just because it lets people know that there's something additional they can do with the visualization. It really stands out. So I have the create property, and this one's just going to create a property. The other one, which is the Dr. Spotfire Actions, this one is going to actually create a property and send email, and it's going to create a case. So this one's configured a little bit differently, where I've put a hard-coded email address in. I could also change this to a prompt if I want to change that to a different email each time. The email subject, I put new properties added. The email message, I'm going to have this as a prompt. I'm going to have a case subject as a prompt, case description as a prompt, and the records have all been hooked up the same way that we did the create property action. So these are all now set up for marking and selecting records. So let's go ahead and take a look at what these actions will do. The first one I'm going to do is actually create property and send email. And so I can drill in on different properties. This is looking at one with high electricity usage and a high, this is looking at the square footage of the floor area. And this is looking at the electricity usage on the y-axis. So we can see that these are, let me make the screen a little bit bigger. These are some of the higher usage, bigger buildings with a higher electricity usage. And I want to maybe submit this to Salesforce and create a property. And I'll actually do one where it sends an email as well, create property and send email. So I'll select that. And the email address, I'll put my own email address in here. And the email message, I'll say high electricity usage property. The case subject will be investigate. And the case description will be investigate high consumption building. And I'll hit next. And what this is going to do is actually create this case in Salesforce. So I'm going to hit approve. And it's also going to send an email to me. We get this little notification that the create property and send email action was successfully initiated. And when I go into my email, give me 1 second, I'll open up my email. I have this email that's coming from Jeff that's been set up. So you can see just 0 minutes ago, this was just sent. High electricity usage property. The case subject was to investigate, and the case description was to investigate high consumption buildings. So this email was sent. And then in Salesforce, Jeff, do you want to show the Salesforce side of things?
Sure, I get the screen right up here ready to go.
Sure. Let me go ahead and share your screen. I've lost my broadcast studio, so 1 second.
Yep.
Okay, so I think okay, sorry about that. I was in StreamYard twice. Okay, so let's go ahead and show Jeff's screen. All right, so Jeff, there you are in Salesforce.
Sure. So what we decided to do in this case was we linked the properties in Spotfire to the account object within Salesforce, and we'll go into the details of what that integration looks like. You can see here that this is the property that was selected, and we go in, and a couple things we notice here that there's this external ID. This is the primary key that comes out of our database that's being accessed by Spotfire, and then the account owner is assigned to Neil for this particular case. And we'll see how that's set up under the hood. And then additionally, for this particular account, and then additionally, we have this case that was created, and we see that the subject of the case was investigate for high building consumption. And we see that this links to the account here. So not only did we create this case, but we also linked this case to the account. And the final step that you saw in our flow was the sending of the email address.
That's right. And I can actually bring that into Spotfire and show the full loop, and then we'll show how we actually built this app. So Jeff, I'm going to share my screen one more time.
Yep.
And let me put us on the sides here. Okay, so show the full loop, how you can bring this back into Spotfire. You can actually connect to Salesforce. So we have a Salesforce connector that I'm going to go to. I'm going to do a new connection, log in with Salesforce. This is prompting me over here on this window. Oh, this is...
Yeah, that's the API user you want to log in as to get access to all the data.
Okay. I think I actually have this already logged into... I already have a connection in here. So yeah. From earlier. So that's a pretty long login. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the login that I already have in Salesforce. So I don't have to do that in front of everyone. So I have this analysis in Salesforce. Let's see. I might have to relog in. Let me open up Slack and let's go ahead and relog in.
So we have an API only user configured that Neil can use to log in also via Salesforce to pull the data directly from Salesforce and sort of close the loop within Spotfire.
Yeah.
But those are read-only operations, as I understand, within Spotfire for the Salesforce connector. So in order to do the updates, what we're doing is we're creating a REST service within TCI Connect under Flogo. And that's part of the TIBCO Cloud Mesh. So that's where you can access it via all the TIBCO products. And that's what we're doing with the Spotfire.
There we go. So now I have it connected to Salesforce, and I see these tables. I'm going to bring in the account table, and I'm going to bring in the cases table as well. And I'm going to hit OK. And these are coming in from Salesforce. I already had some of these tables in, so it's going to be account 2 and case 2. I'm going to hit OK. And let's go ahead and add another page here. And I'm going to use this account 2 table. You can see this property that I just logged, 301 Cermak Road. And I'm going to do another property, which is on case 2, or I'm going to do the cases. So you can see this case that was logged as well. So this is bringing it back into Spotfire. So this is investigate the high usage, high consumption building. It has all the details of that case. So I can go through now and I can actually take action here where as I'm doing a deeper analysis, I can find like, okay, I want to submit something for some of these cases or some of these properties, Wacker Drive, Pulaski Avenue, Cicero Avenue. And I can actually go ahead and I can just create properties for these without sending emails. I can use this create property one. It has all these locations here. I can hit approve, and this is going to send it to the external action is successfully initiated. So this is sending it to Salesforce. And then I can go back to my Salesforce side and I can refresh my data. And you can see here's those new properties that I just put in. The locations were on Cicero Avenue, Pulaski Avenue, Wacker Drive. All of those were all put in here. So just that simple, that easy from a single click. It's already been configured. So the first time I did this, you saw the flyout where I configured it. But once you have it configured, then you can send it out to your business users and they can use it just streamlined as part of their application. So let's actually go behind the scenes now and show, like, how did we create this? How did we create such an action and wire this up to send an email and to write to Salesforce, create a Salesforce ID? So Jeff, do you want to go ahead and share your screen, and I'll bring things over onto your screen.
Sure, we'll walk right through it.
Okay, so your screen's now visible if you want to go ahead and show through it.
Sure. So taking a step back, we'll do the bottom-up approach on how we configured all this. But at the high level, what we have is we have a couple REST endpoints that we're creating within Flogo. And those REST endpoints, when we make them private within TCI, they become available and exposed through the TIBCO Cloud Mesh. Now, the TIBCO Cloud Mesh is available to not only Spotfire, it's also available to Mashery as API management. It's also available within Bridgewater BW, which is BusinessWorks, and then Flogo and BusinessWorks can communicate back and forth with each other. So the TIBCO Cloud Mesh actually gives you the ability to communicate in the private network between all these various TIBCO products. So in this example, what we're doing is we're creating Flogo as an endpoint, and then we're going to use Dr. Spotfire to push some data to those endpoints. So the first thing we're going to do is think about what the architecture is going to be. We want to think about what our REST scheme is going to look like and what data we want to send over and what systems we're going to want to interface with. So in this case, we're going to be we decided to integrate with Salesforce. The reason I choose Salesforce is because it does give you a free developer's license. It's really easy to use as an example. Once you have your connectivity established to any system, you can obviously push data to that as part of the integration. So the first thing we did was we created a connection within Salesforce to our test system. And what we're going to do is just look at what the parameters are on that. And that's a pretty straightforward setup on this. What you're going to want to do is just give your connection a name, a description, and then you're going to use the OAuth to enter in your credentials, and that's going to set up that token and get that ready for you. And I think I may have clicked it twice by accident. All right, so this is what that connection screen looks like after you configure it. When you first create a new connection, you would select that connection type, and then you would put the name in. And in this case, when we do the authentication, we would log in with our user and password, just like we did via Spotfire. And then now we have that connection that's established. And once we have that connection, we can perform actions against that particular endpoint. So now we have our baseline connection. And for the SMTP connectivity, there's an action built in. We don't need to create a connection for SMTP. There's an action within Flogo, which has all the parameters that it needs. What you're going to want to do in this case is, and I used my private email address for this because my personal email, because I had to configure a special password for an app at a lower level security. So normally, if your email is set up with two-factor authentication, in this case, you're using Gmail, you have to go into the Gmail to configure a special password that they give you just for this one app, and that's the password that gets entered into the configuration when you do the SMTP. So as always with integration, there's that groundwork you have to lay first. You have to get the connection set up. You have to make sure you have your base systems, the security, everything set up on those so you can access them. After that, what you want to do is head over to Flogo, and you're going to create an app, a Flogo app, and I'm going to start adding some flows to that particular app. So in this case, the app is going to have two endpoints, two flows into it, and we'll show you what those look like and how they utilize the connectivity and how they pull the data in, what the schemas are for that. So once you create the app, what I like to do is make an app-wide schema. You can either manually enter the schemas in for these REST endpoints, or you can create a schema that's used throughout the app. And then that's really probably the best practice for that is to have a schemas, and we'll show what those look like. So here we have this app called Dr. Spotfire Actions, and this is the one that Neil connected to when he logged on to TCI. And this is where, when you first create this app, what's going to happen is it's going to be set as public. This will say public here. And the steps on this are to work through it while it's public. use Postman to test the endpoints. And then once you're satisfied that everything works, then you click up here, make it private, and then that will be available now through Spotfire. So let's look at the schemas that we're using for this particular app. And we have the schema. So you notice that Neil had two actions there, one to just add properties and one to add properties and do the cases, as well as send the email address. Now, the one for just the properties, and this is going to be, when you're creating these schemas, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either use JSON schema and put in what the actual, what a schema definition looks like, or you can put in some sample JSON, and then it will rewrite this as a schema. So let me just open this up on my other
Yeah, I know that
1 second.
writing JSON might be a little bit new for our Spotfire users, but it's really pretty simple to set up the JSON schema. So maybe you can show us how you set that up. And
yeah, I'm going to open that up real fast. 1 second. I'm going to open the property schema, and then okay. So let me bring this over the screen over my little notepad screen here. So what you can do is get some sample data that you want to have, and then you will just cut and paste this in as cut and paste the sample JSON, and it will create a schema for you. And this is what the schema looks like. So we have this properties schema, and this is what the schema looks like, and we have this properties data, which is what the actual data coming over looks like. But if you wanted to, let's head over and let's create a new schema, all right? And we'll call it properties 2, all right? And what we're going to do is we're going to paste the actual data into it. And you can see here what we've done if we pasted our sample data into the schema definition here. But now once we save it, what Flogo does behind the scenes is it actually converts that to the JSON schema itself. So let's look what the difference on those two are. So one is the data. And if you know databases, it's, this is the equivalent is the data versus the database schema. This is what data looks like. And what the schema looks like is pretty straightforward. What we have is we have an object of type property. And that's the case schema. We need the property schema. Okay, here's the property schema. So we have the highest level is always an object, and the properties. This is actually not the properties we're talking about. These are the properties of this particular object, right? This JSON schema. And what we have is an array of records, and then each item in this array has these fields. It has an ID, the property name, the address, the zip code, community area, latitude, and longitude, right? And the community area is essentially the city or the neighborhood in which it's located. So this is what actually gets exposed as part of the typical cloud mesh. This schema is defined in our flow. This gets exposed to the mesh, and then when Neil on the on the Spotfire side opens that up and links these fields, this is where those fields are coming from. Is the actual schema.
That flyout that I saw had certain fields that I need to look up, and I set those to like the first ID, the first property name, use the first aggregation on that flyout. That was all lining it up to this part of the schema that you set up for me.
Right. And there's one little trick here when you're using the typical cloud mesh within Spotfire is sometimes with JSON, you can have a generic array where you don't give it a name called records. You just have a generic array. If I took out this records here, this would actually be a generic array, right? Take out one of these, we'd end up with a generic array. But actually, Spotfire doesn't acknowledge this. It needs a named array. So we just put the word records in here to name this particular array. But ultimately, what happens is this is basically the list of records he's sending over that he selects, gets formatted as JSON, and gets pushed into these fields. Now, this is what the data actually looks like when it comes over. It comes over as a little identifier here, just like a database table, right? This is called records, and then these are the fields and the values of those particular fields, right? That's pretty straightforward in terms of how you define these JSON schemas. But I wanted to show you a couple other schemas that we have. So we have a reply schema, which is basically just a status string that we send back. We have the property schema, which is one we just showed you, which just gives us the list of properties. But the other schema that we have is one that includes the properties, and it's one that is used to generate the cases. And what this particular flow does, we'll go into the logic of that. But what we're doing in this case is we're sending over, and let's just look at what the data looks like for that. We're sending over a bunch of properties as well as these fields at the beginning. So we have, in addition to what we've added to our base schema of just a list of records, we've added a few fields on top of it, right? And these fields are the email subject, email message, the case subject, and the case description. And again, when Spotfire is reading this in, you can configure it to either have hard-coded values or to set these up as prompts. And then what it's doing is it's passing these values in as part of the JSON. So the two JSONs are pretty similar. One is just going to be, one's just going to be the list of records, and the other is the same thing, a list of records with this additional information on it, because we're performing additional actions on top of just adding those simple properties.
All right.
All right.
Yeah. So,
any questions coming in from the studio audience there, or should we just keep going?
I think we should keep going. There was a question. Let me bring this one up. Is this feature available for on-premise setup? The way this works is like you can use on-premise databases with this, but you need to use the TIBCO Cloud integration. Currently, as of today, you need to use the TIBCO Cloud integration as a go-between for integrating with your database.
Yes, and you can create these integrations with on-premise data sources. What you would do, there's some additional configuration on that. You would need to install a hybrid agent on a machine behind your firewall that has that's on the network that's going to attach that data source, and you can create a connection to that data source. There's some additional configuration. You have to get a key. You have to configure the other pieces in here. It's a little beyond, I think, what we're doing, but that's all available in the help. And you can join one of our Docker integration sessions if you have any questions on how to configure one of those on-premise sources. But yes, you can. And then the TIBCO hybrid agent acts as a bridge, acts as a little VPN between the cloud and your on-premise data source. So even though your endpoints are still potentially public, or in this case, in the private cloud, accessed via the cloud, the initial call is made in the cloud. You can still, via the hybrid agent and on-premise configurations, access those on-premise data sources.
Thanks, Jeff. And then also there was a question from Tusef. Can we use Spotfire Actions along with Spotfire mods? From what I can tell, we can. So if I bring in a mod such as, let's say, a circular tree map, and then I go into the settings, actions are in there, and I can create an action as well. So add that action, the floating button, which I get to choose my action here, send a property an email, and it shows up there with this mod. So that's good news. Actions and mods can be used together. And all right, well, from there, Jeff, do you want to go ahead and show us how we build the actual Flogo app with that JSON that you?
I do. I just want to show you one more schema that we're using, and this schema is going to be used internally. So the properties schema, the JSON, that's going to be used for the properties call that we're making to add the properties. This one is going to be, we built on that, added some information for emails and the case description we needed for that. But there's another one we want to use internally that we need to generate an array that maps our Salesforce ID to the cases that we're going to be adding. So anytime we add a case within Salesforce, we need that parent ID for the account. We need that native Salesforce ID to link it to the account. And in order to do that, what we have to do is go through a little process, loop through the records we have, and then create this little array called cases. This is internally, and what this is basically here is just some information that we need that we're going to be using to push the case out. So there's the parent ID, which is the ID of the account. There's an external ID we're creating, and the subject and description are also part of this particular piece here. So not only can you create JSON schemas for use in your incoming REST calls, you can also create them as internal data structures you can use in order to assemble the data that you need in the right structure. All right, and we'll show how that works. All right, so we can see we have two flows here. And now normally when you create a flow, it's going to ask you what sort of trigger you want. And in this case, the trigger we used is basically receive HTTP message, and that's going to generate this endpoint for us. Now, when you turn this off, you'll see that the typical Cloud Mesh will generate a endpoint for you with a very long string, and then the endpoint, it's the final part of the path will be defined within your flow itself.
And Jeff, can you just quickly show that receive HTTP message, how that was created?
Sure. So if you wanted to, so what you would do here, let's just create a new flow quickly here and see what it looks like, right? All right. So first thing we do is give it a quick name. We create a flow. Once we create it, it's going to ask us if we want a trigger for that. So we will start with the trigger, and then we can select an existing trigger. And what this is basically it generated an endpoint, and we're adding it generated a URL, and we're adding endpoints to this URL. Or we could add a new trigger, and we have a lot of different options here.
Can you scroll through some of those triggers?
Sure. So we can we have app start and shutdown. There's HTTP server, we have GraphQL, we have Kafka. There's a bunch of different ones. There's timers, WebSockets. There's a variety of different triggers we can use within Flogo to instantiate the app when it runs a particular flow.
So we're going to use the rest or receive HTTP message every time if we want this to work with a Spotfire action. Now you can have that Flogo app that we're creating, this flow triggered on a timer and triggered by all these other things that Jeff just showed you. But if you want it to be a human in the loop Spotfire action from Spotfire, you're always going to use this option.
Right. And the interesting thing too is once I create this flow and set it up, I can access it via Spotfire, but I can also access it via BusinessWorks, the same flow, the same app I can access via BusinessWorks. I can access it via API management. Once it's part of the TIBCO Cloud Mesh, all the TIBCO products can access these private endpoints. And that's really one of the benefits that we have. So in this case, what we're doing here is we set up a post. So we say we wanted to post just cases. We could say cases here. And then what we do is we set up the request and the response schema, configure it here. And what you can do is you can use one of the existing schemas. And in this case, that's what we would do here. We use one of the existing schemas. And that's how we configure this for our previous endpoints. Right? So we'll see. Never get phone calls. All right. So we'll see what that looks like once we've configured it here. So let's just delete this one. All right. So now we have two flows, and basically each of these flows is going to be an endpoint. Now let's step into it and see what this looks like as far as editing it goes. Now there's a bunch of stuff on the screen here that we want to kind of look at and make sure we understand. All right. So on this side here, this is the trigger. This is the trigger that's configured for this particular flow. Now, in this case, the trigger is HTTP. All right. So we can see when we open this up, we can see how this is configured. All right. So basic stuff around HTTP, the settings are going to be, this is a post because we're taking in data. We're using JSON, and the path in this case is called properties. And this is what behind the scenes Spotfire is going to send to this particular endpoint. All right. Now, the output settings are essentially what the parameters are and what the JSON is for this particular REST call. And we can see we can also add parameters to this REST call if we wanted to. We can add path parameters. We can add query parameters. We can also look at the headers. And here's something we want to make note here. When Spotfire sends out these calls, it includes a header called x-TIBCO CIC user. And what this is this is actually the email address of the user making this particular call. And we're going to leverage this within our flow in order to assign the accounts to the person who's logged in on TIBCO Spotfire making the actual call. So any new accounts that are created are going to be assigned to this particular person. Right? And we can see here that what we've done is we've decided to use one of our schemas, and the schema here is the one that we saw previously, which just has the property, right? And what we select we're selecting our property schema from our list of schemas, and this is what we're expecting as an incoming JSON REST call. All right. So that's pretty straightforward in how we configure the HTTP. Now what you need to do is sync the flow itself to sync the flow schema to the REST schema. Now, probably 99 out of 100 times, your REST schema is going to match your flow schema, but it is possible to have multiple triggers on a single flow. So in theory, I could add additional triggers, maybe like a GraphQL or some other input, which could still map to this flow. So Flogo has some advanced features that allow you to do that. But
can we pause for just a second and maybe you can explain this interface right here, what
Sure.
we're looking at? Yeah, so we have on the left column, we have that REST HTTP, that receive HTTP message, right? Those are the triggers. Then you have in the middle, you have your mapping, right, of your schemas.
Yes. So what we have here is we have on the left, we have our triggers. Most of the time, you're going to have one trigger. In the middle, so think of Flogo as very functional, right? Flogo, everything is some type of input and some type of output, right? So everything, all the activities are considered like functions. They have inputs and outputs. The flow itself has inputs and outputs, and the trigger also has inputs and outputs. Now, the input to the trigger is essentially the incoming REST call, and the output is the data that it's sending into the flow. The input of the flow is essentially the parameters of a functional call, and then the outputs of the flow is what finally gets returned back to the initial caller. So there's sort of three sections here. There's the trigger, which is going to have our definition of our REST. There's this kind of weird hidden one here, which is the schema of the actual flow itself. So I have the inputs, and the schema is essentially the same thing, but with all the information that you could have coming in. So it has all the headers. It has the schema of the records coming in, and then the output is what gets sent back to the trigger. And in this case, the output is just going to be a simple status that says okay, and that is received. Now, once you're here, then each one of these is an action. And this is where the actual logic happens that we interface with our systems, right? So what we have here is when we have an action here, we have
just a simple system log, right?
Yeah, system log. So we have the input here. What we're seeing here in this is we have this is the output that we have. So the output of everything upstream is what you have access to. So the flow itself, in this case, we can see we have a list of headers, all right? So what we're doing here is just writing out this user, this TIBCO CSA user, writing this out to the message just to make sure that we're logging that user, all right? And then what we're doing here is we are within the body. Now we have the records, and the records are an array, and we're going to use that in the future. And then some other there's properties that go along with it, and then there's app properties, and there's other IDs and things like that are using if you need some metadata about the flow itself. All right. Neil, you still there?
Yep, still here.
Yep, just making sure. I think my internet connection is a little wonky, but so make sure everything's going smoothly. Okay, so this is a very simple log, what we're doing here. But now what we're going to do in this case is we're going to use some of this data and execute a activity for Salesforce. So what we're doing in this case is we want to query the user in Salesforce so we can get the user ID so we can assign the account to that particular user. So in this case, what we've done is we've added a Salesforce query object here, activity here. And then the connection is this one the connection that we created. And the object in this case is the user. And the input is going to be a query. And this is basically going to be our SOQL query. And what we're doing is we're saying, get the ID from the user, where email equals this email of the user that came in as part of our headers. So in this case, this is Neil's email address that's coming in. He's set up as a user within Salesforce, and we're just returning the row ID from Salesforce, the primary key, so we can use it in our other actions.
So it's just generating a query that you're going to run to query that database, right? So you just put together that string and you kind of parameterized it with my email address.
Exactly. Okay. All right.
So
and now
we can do personalized queries that way.
Yeah, you can parameterize the queries. In this case, I just added it to the string. So in this case, it's a select statement, and I just added it to the string here, and that's how I parameterized it. Insert statements can be set up with different types. There's different ways to parameterize things if you're using an insert statement. It ends up as a parameter coming in, and you pull that in. But this is a very simple query. We're just getting the ID from that email. Very simple. But the point here, though, is that now that we've executed this query, we have the output from this activity that we can use further along. And again, this log Salesforce ID, this is just here for debugging purposes, right? Making sure that we actually pulled the output of that query, all right? And we said, hey, just log out the ID of that, so we know that we've correctly logged that, we've correctly retrieved that particular user. Okay, so now a couple log activities here just to write stuff out to make sure everything's working. We have this Salesforce query that gives us the ID.
Could you maybe zoom in just a click on this with just the browser zoom?
Sure. Let me how's that?
That looks great. Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully the dialogues aren't too big. If they are, you can come back out.
So. Yeah, we'll fix that up there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create the upsert. We can use the upsert operation in Salesforce to write the accounts to write the incoming records to Salesforce as accounts. So when we configure this, we see we have the typical thing in the settings. We just have the connection, which we've selected as the one we entered. In this case, the object we select from the dropdown is the account object. And now the input to this is going to be the input to this particular object, this particular activity. And this activity is expecting an array of account records. So we can see that the input to this activity, we have the input, it's an account object, and it's expecting an array. And what we're doing here is we're seeing these are all the fields that are part of your standard Salesforce object. And in addition to that field, we configured an external ID field, which we'll see at the bottom. And this external ID field is configured in Salesforce. And we're going to move that ID from the record, which is the primary key within our source system. And we're going to use that as the external ID within Salesforce. And that's how the upsert operation works. So Salesforce.
So what we have is from the schema that you defined, it's going to bring in certain data from my Spotfire analysis. This was set up with those residential and commercial properties. So there was an ID on there, which Jeff is now calling an external ID, right?
Yes.
There's an ID of the properties in my Spotfire dashboard. There was address, there was a name, there was latitude and longitude. So those are all set up to come in through this Flogo app, but they need to be mapped to Salesforce, and Salesforce has a ton of fields. You're seeing right here, there's a bunch of billing addresses, fax, phone, rating. There's a lot of empty fields there. And so what Jeff is doing is taking the available fields and mapping it to where it should go in the available Salesforce fields.
Yes. And what we did previous to this that you didn't see was we created a custom field in Salesforce. So we called it external ID right here. All right. And we configured this as an external ID. And this is the field that's used to match on the upsert operation. Right. So we can see what we have here is we have this configured as external ID, and we have the duplicate set up as case sensitive. That's up to you. But the key thing here is that when you create a text file in Salesforce, you configure this as an external ID, and then you specify that field to use as the match field on the upsert. Now, what is an upsert operation? Well, an upsert operation is an API call that reduces the number of API, is a REST call that reduces the number of API hits because it will either update or insert a new record based upon if it already matches. This is a very common integration pattern, the one that we set up here in this example. All right. So let's take a step back. So this shows you the mapping, but how do we get to this loop? This activity is expecting an array of records. So in order to input an array of records, we have to define what loop we're going to use and what it's going to point to. So in this case, what we decided was Well, actually, we didn't need a loop in this case because we're mapping an array to an array. But if we are not doing that, we would use a loop. So in this case, on the input, what we did was in order to determine which array it's mapped against, we went to the type here, this array of records, and we mapped it to the flow body.
Then you have
expand the body, records,
right? And the records, right?
Yeah. So when you drag this over here, and I'll show you what that looks like, right? This is what it looks like, right? And what does this say? This says that to generate this array, loop through this array. And this array is just the array of incoming records. So what this does is it's going to loop through this array, the array of incoming records. And then when we do the field mapping, we map it via the loop. It's via the loop itself. All right. So then once we are mapping here, say we map the name, we drag the name from the property name here, and it tells us a loop property name. So that's how it knows what records are the source records this particular array to loop.
Now, Jeff, those activity inputs for the Salesforce upsert, were they all automatically created in records there?
Yes. What happens is, so the way that these get created here is when you select the connection is going to read the schema for your particular Salesforce instance, and it's going to retrieve both standard and custom objects. And then those objects appear in the drop down here. Once you select the object in the drop down,
that's the account table that we were looking at earlier. Okay.
Exactly. And once you select the account table in your object here, it configures the input to use an account object, and then it pulls in all the fields from the schema that are in the account object that you're using to upsert the data right here. Right? Now, if I had selected a different table here, and we'll see what that looks like, what it would say, and we'll see what it looks like in our other example, it would say cases, and then it would say the array of records, because it's always expecting an array of records, and then it would show the fields that are associated with the case.
Right. Great.
So this is really, I think, the key piece here is that you have to understand how to get these arrays to work within Flogo.
Yeah.
That's the key piece. This is the main thing. And once you understand that, you need to first map your array to the array, and then now you can map the fields to the fields. You just have to figure out which array I'm mapping to which array. So in this case, we're mapping the input array to loop through that, and then we're going to create the array to send out to the upsert operation. And this gets sent out as a single call, right? So all this data is assembled as an array, and then it gets sent out as a single upsert operation to Salesforce, because we want to use batch within our integrations to reduce the number of API calls onto our endpoints.
Okay. And while we're on this page, could you actually show us, by adding an activity, could you show us all the available activities that are possible with?
Thank you for the reminder on that. I was thinking of doing that. Okay. So we can see that within Flogo, we have tons and tons and tons of activities, right? So we can use Adobe Design, right? We have all sorts of Amazon S3s, Audit Safe. We have a lot of the TIBCO products that we can interact with, right? We can pull things from Box. Default has these different ones here, so we can execute JavaScript. We have a bunch of different things. There's the default one. We have Dropbox.
There's Snowflake, Google.
There's Snowflake, Google Docs, right?
Google
There's
Docs, Google
HubSpot,
Sheets.
Kafka. There's Lambda functions, right?
Mm-hmm.
All kinds of different databases, different SAP connectors, Salesforce, right? Sugar, Stripe. We can connect to other TIBCO cloud pieces, WebSockets. There's plenty. There's all these different ones, and each one of these will have its own particular type of activities, right? So say we went to Oracle PostgreSQL, we would see these are the sub-activity types we have. We can do a delete, insert, query, or an update, right? Now, Oracle DB, similar, right? For MySQL, these are all similar ones. But for something like messaging, we have get message, acknowledge message, and public message, right? So these are the typical cloud messaging EFTLs that we can connect to also. All right. So each of the activities has its own little sub activity, and once you're in there, you configure each of these activities with the appropriate data that it needs in the appropriate fields it needs to execute that particular activity.
Great. Yeah.
All right.
And then do you want to show us, we got a few minutes left, but do you want to show us the flow where you use the SMTP server and to send an email? And I think that'll be of interest to some of our users and viewers here.
Absolutely. Let's quickly review this one. So this one, we receive this flow. We receive a
HTTP.
See the HTTP. Then that gets pushed in. The important thing, we query Salesforce to get the ID. And then when we do this upsert operation on the input, let's just show where that's mapped to that. It's going to be the owner. The owner ID is the one that gets mapped, which is here. Right? And we see this is the output of this particular operation. So we're able to pull in anything that's upstream. We're able to pull data in for that. Okay, great. So now we're going to build on that. So this other one is going to build on that. And in this case, we're using the same URL. In this case, the schema is the one that we defined, which has the additional properties, the email data and the subject and the case data. So we have that, right? And aside from that, the flow is very similar. We log the user. We did this query to get the user ID out of Salesforce, and we logged that user ID. This is all just debugging. These logs are just debugging, right? Then what we did was we upserted the accounts, all right? Did the same exact thing, right? Now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to create an array of records which associate our we're going to basically bring back the array of IDs from Salesforce, because in order to add the case, we need the parent. So database theory, there's the foreign key relationship. So we add the case, we want to associate it to the account. In order to associate to the account, we actually need the Salesforce ID. And if we look at the output of this upsert account, we didn't use the output previously. Now, we would have if we were using some error correction and such. But the output in this case is an output. It's a response, and this response gives us an array that we can see, and the ID is the primary key of the Salesforce ID, and that's something that we want to have and use. And then any errors that are associated with that particular operation. All right. So we're going to actually leverage that. I'm going to create this intermediate array that we're using in order to associate the basically just to get to associate the ID with the parent ID of the account, and then create the external ID that we're using to do the upsert. And what this does is this actually uses a loop, and what it does is the output in the out. So the input is actually a single. The schema is actually a single record schema, which just has these properties: ID, parent ID, external ID, subject description, everything that we need as part of our case object. And then the input in this case is part of the loop. We turn an iterator on. We loop through the records. And as we loop through the records, we're going to assemble we're going to associate the ID that came out of Salesforce in a new array to match it up to the record that we have on the incoming call. And then that's going to together give us what we need in order to make that case, to be able to create that case object. So it's a little unusual what we do here. So we have this loop with an iterator that we accumulate. So the output ends up being an array of records, and the output we can see here is going to be this array of records that have all these fields in it. That's the schema. That's the internal schema that I talked about for the cases. All right. So then this is just another log to make sure all that data is correct. And then we do here is we do the upsert of the cases. And instead of for the source on this, all right, so when we do the cases, notice how we have our settings is the same. We have this Dr. Spotfire connection, the case object. The input here that we care about is what we're getting mapped to. In this case, it's an array of cases, all right? But now what we see is when we do this array of cases, the records come from the mapper, the output of the mapper, which is an array, all right? And then what we do is we put each of these on here. So the account ID is what the parent ID is. This is what we needed. This is why we needed the mapper, because we needed to get that account ID from the parent to associate it with the case that we're adding. And then the subject and description, these are coming directly out of the input. All right. And then the owner ID, same exact thing, is coming from that lookup. So we're pulling data from a variety of sources. And then this external ID is what came from the loop, right? And then that is what we need to create the cases, and that's how those cases get created. But the mapper here, the way this associated happened was, the key piece here was this. So in the input, we have the ID is just the ID that we came in from the original iteration, and the thing that we're iterating against is the original JSON coming in. The parent ID, though, is actually we took the index out of the array. So as this array loops through, it gives an index into the array. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, typical indexing. And the way we made the association between the output of the upsert operation and the initial input of the list of records was by this particular statement here. So we took the activity output response and we used the iteration index to get the ID. And that's how we got the ID, the Salesforce ID, out of the output for the Salesforce upsert operation. So this is how we made the association. We looped through it, and then we got this value and put it in the same record with this value, and that's how we made the association. It's one of those really subtle things that you need to be aware of how to do within Flogo. But again, Doctor integration, join us for the sessions. We have office hours. We're glad to help you out with all of that. And there's a lot of this.
And realize that a lot of this might be very new, maybe overwhelming for the Spotfire audiences. And this is something where it's just good to know what's available to you. If you want to use these integration platforms in the integration suite, but you may not be expected to know all of this. You can also always work with your IT or some other developer in your organization that's more familiar with APIs. And together you can create these really powerful apps that take actions directly. But if you wanted to try it on your own, we're going through a lot of detail here to make sure that you know every step and every possible way to create something like a Salesforce write back and send email.
Yep.
But for those the developer personas and developer roles at your organization, you may want to have them join the Doctor integration sessions as well to learn more about how this all works. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We have just a couple more minutes, Jeff. Did you want to wrap up?
Yeah, just quickly wrap up on the send email is pretty straightforward. We just have this add to send email activity. The settings, again, are going to be all of the information that you need to send for your SMTP. And in this case, this password is a single generated password within Google for the apps. And the input here is the same exact thing. We just have the content type, the senders, right? The message, everything like that. The subject comes from the input. The message is basically what we saw here, the email message with a bunch of concatenation on all the other data that comes in. So that was, once you have this configured to function, once you open up your SMTP to be able to, you configure the account to use your SMTP. The send email is very easy to use. We also have one for MailChimp, and additionally, if you have a MailChimp account, you can use that.
All right, great. Well, that was a whirlwind tour of Spotfire Actions with TIBCO Cloud Integration. I know it's the first time a lot of people here have seen TIBCO Cloud Integration and worked with JSON schemas, and I think you did a great job of explaining how all that works. So thank you very much, Jeff. And for our viewers, if you have any other questions about this, you can email us at drspotfire@tibco.com. You can ask questions in the comments. We're always monitoring the comments. This is the first step of a broader workflow and in innovations in Spotfire Actions. So this is using TIBCO Cloud Actions, but there is going to be further development in this area to make things more accessible. And if you have questions on how those expanded capabilities are going to work and what Spotfire Actions future roadmap looks like, you can also email us at drspotfire@tibco.com. And we'll connect you with the product manager who can tell you more about the future of actions in Spotfire. So thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us today. It was great to have a collaboration with.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. And with that, I think we'll end our session just a few seconds before the top of the hour. So thank you all for joining.